Around there. So welcome to our debate on whether there is unconscious perception. This is the latest in a series of debates organized by the Center for Mind, Brain, and Consciousness, of which the directors are Ned Block and me, Dave Chalmers. We've been having one debate a semester on a wide variety of topics in the foundations of the mind, brain, sciences. To date, all of our debates have been relatively sedate affairs with just one debater on each side. So this time we decided to loosen up the parameters and go for 3-on-2 debating and see how that goes. I say all the credit for organizing this debate really goes to Ned, who, however, and who, however, couldn't moderate due to a conflict of interest. So I'm taking over. The topic is whether there is unconscious perception. I think that for a long time in the history of philosophy and psychology, there was a background view that perception was always perhaps by nature conscious. But the idea that there is unconscious perception has been around for quite a long time. It's often said that the very first experimental psychology done in the US involved an experiment on unconscious perception by the philosopher Charles Sanders Peirce and Joseph Jastrow, doing in a work published in 1884 about unconscious discriminations of pressures on a fingertip. And allegedly, people could register one as heavier than the other, even though they didn't report noticing that one was heavier than the other, and that was argued by Peirce and Jastrow to be a kind of unconscious perception. But the idea has really taken off in recent decades. I mean, it's probably helped along by those apocryphal experiments in the 1950s about flashing drink Coca-Cola between the frames of film in the movie theater, after which sales of Coca-Cola went up 44% at the interval. It didn't happen, but it seems to have helped along the research program all the same. I think the trend in the ensuing decades was gradually towards unconscious perception. Various experimental contexts where at least appears that a stimulus makes a difference to a subject's behavior, even though when the subject is asked to report whether they perceive a stimulus or not, they deny perceiving anything. So this happens with briefly presented stimuli followed by a mask. This happens with some neurological patients like blind sight subjects who seem to be able to show up to, when given, for example, a forced choice, can show sensitivity to a certain stimulus, even though they report seeing nothing. Most recently, it's happened with some binocular suppression effects, such as continuous flash suppression, where a stimulus to one eye suppresses what goes on in the other eye, and you get at least a prima facie profile of unconscious perception, a difference in behavior, perhaps forced choice, perhaps priming of a labor effect, even though the subject reports seeing nothing. But there's also been a tradition of being somewhat skeptical about whether there is truly unconscious perception. I think my sense is in recent years the pendulum has been swinging towards favoring the hypothesis that there's unconscious perception. But just in the last few years, there's been, I think, a renewed wave of skepticism. I mean, the skepticism takes a couple of different forms. Roughly, the first form is skepticism that alleged cases of unconscious perception are really unconscious. Maybe there's actually traces of consciousness involved. And secondly, skepticism that the alleged forms of unconscious perception are really perception. Maybe they're merely unconscious representation by parts of the visual system that don't really count as person level perception. I think we're going to have both of those views represented today. In the debate today involves both psychologists and cognitive neuroscientists and philosophers. We have Marisa Carrasco. We're going to start with the psychology sub-debate, if you like, between Marisa Carrasco from NYU and Hakan Lau and Megan Peters from UCLA, and then we're going to follow it up with the philosophy sub-debate between Ned Block from NYU and Ian Phillips from Oxford. I think we'll find these debates have an awful lot of parts in common. but I think there's the potential for a lot of rich interaction between the psychology, the neuroscience, and the philosophy here. The way it's going to work is we'll have Marisa speaking for 15 minutes, then Hakwan and Megan will give related talks for about 10 minutes each, and then Ned for 15 and Ian for 15, then we'll open it up for some discussion among the panel and some interaction with the audience. But for our first speaker, it's a great pleasure to welcome my colleague Marisa Carrasco from Psychology and Neuroscience at NYU. I should say that the overhead display here is suboptimal for reasons of no problem, no fault due to Marisa, just the equipment here. However, it does.
Are going to suffer the same. Apparently, one is not working, so one was in color with red.
It does offer the opportunity for some unconscious sensitivity to blurry distinction. So, to you best with field work, and please welcome Marisa.
I'm going to start. So thanks to the organizers, and thanks for having me here. I'm going to avoid looking at the display because it looks horrible. It's my poor son. He's angry enough to have his eyes distorted for reasons of a stimulus presentation, but that color is too much. So, I'm going to talk about perception with and without awareness, and I have to say that I came to this topic through the side door, and it's going to become clear what I mean by that. And if time permits, I would be more than happy to tell you how we stumbled upon the findings that I want to talk about, which are relevant for this debate, even though the studies were not conducted to address this debate. The topic of unconscious perception is controversial, not only because there's no consensus regarding the definition of unconscious, but also because there are many definitions of perception. Some include consciousness or awareness, and under those definitions, there's no point to discuss today's topic. We could just go home. But there are other definitions of perceptions, as the ones that I hope that you can see here, as the representation of information from a stimulus without any assumption that it is necessarily experienced consciously. And it's been pointed out, and it's relevant for this debate, that it should be an individual level phenomenon, not merely an occurrence in an individual's visual system or brain, but rather it should reflect a representation of features of the physical environment. Now, for some time, we have known that eye movements can reflect cognition. Actually, eye movements have been used in many disciplines, in psychology, neuroscience, in developmental studies, categorization, emotion, neuropsychology, and they are based on the assumption that they reflect what we see, perceive, think, or desire. This is a very early study by Yarbus in '67, and what we can see here is a painting that is called The Unexpected Return, and what he found is that, you cannot see that there, is there a pointer somewhere? What he found is that the pattern of eye movements was different in response to this painting as a function of what observers were asked to judge. For example, thank you so much, in the top left, you can see the eye movements when people were asked to judge what activities were taking place before the entry of the unexpected visitor. And on the bottom left, those are the patterns of eye movements that took place when someone was asked to respond, how long was the person gone? Now, as you can see in the bottom, for example, this would be reflecting the facial expressions, and it's not surprising because if you're trying to read the painting, that's where your eyes are going to go. So it has been long held that eye movements reflect our perception. We know that eye movements improve many aspects of vision, and we know that there are close links between perception and eye movements. In particular, saccades and microsaccades, as well as voluntary pursuit and reflexive ocular follow and response. More recently, with my former postdoc, Miriam Sperring, now assistant professor at UBC, we published a review in which we report that eye movements reflect visual processing without awareness. The cover here, which is distorted, says, when the eyes act on what they do not see. And what we did was review a number of studies that show that perceptual reports on eye movements differ. And they differ in three categories. The first one, we grouped the studies that show uncorrelated responses on a trial basis, notwithstanding the fact that the average reported perceptions and eye movements correlated. But if you look at the trial-by-trial basis, there's zero correlation. The second group are those studies that show a quantitative difference. That is when the eyes move faster or with a lower threshold than our perception. And the third group shows qualitative dissociations, which I think that are the most interesting ones. And I'm going to tell you two studies that Miriam and I conducted some years ago that show not only that that show qualitative dissociations, meaning that the response that the eyes give and the perception go in different directions, but in a lawful way. In order to do these studies, we use binocular rivalry for suppression. So we know there are two eyes with partially overlapping information, and it's useful for depth perception. We know, as David mentioned, that binocular rivalry has been studied to address many issues in vision, including issues of awareness. And what we did was to present different information to each eye. So by using this stereoscope, what you can do is present different information to the left and to the right eye, as is represented by the icon on the upper right. And what is good is that this dichotic display offers the advantage of presenting two stimuli with the same physical strength to both eyes, yet producing a percept in which one stimulus is stronger than the other. And here's an example. So imagine that on your left eye, you're seeing downward motion. On the right eye, you're seeing rightward motion because that's what's being projected to you through the stereoscope. And the question is, what do your eye perceive? What do you perceive? Do you perceive what goes to one eye? Or do you actually perceive the average motion of this pattern that goes in the right downward perception? Okay? When you are looking through the stereoscope, you have no idea of which information comes from which eye. And if you present simply these two patterns to each eye, this is what you perceive. Now, we use this and we adapted it to the binocular rivalry flash suppression. So if you were looking at this display, one stimulus will be presented to your left eye, and briefly after, two stimuli are presented simultaneously. In this case, the same stimulus is presented to the left eye, so we're going to refer to that as the same stimulus, and an orthogonal stimulus is presented to the other eye. And at the end, you can respond what you saw via either, in some of the studies we use this, we present this arrow and we ask you to rotate the arrow to match the orientation that you saw. And in other studies, we have this big asterisk that has different spokes. And we actually ask observers to tell us that if they saw a mixture, for example, if they saw strong motion going down, they should use this downward motion spoke and indicate there's 10 intervals, indicate that that's very strong. If they saw a little bit of the rightward motion at the same time, then they should use the rightward motion spoke. And if they saw the average motion, then they should use this diagonal. Is that clear? And we actually invite them to respond to 1, 2, or 3 motions. Now, this is what happens. Virtually all perceptual responses, above 95% of them, correspond to the orthogonal stimulus. There's about 1% of responses that go in the average motion and about 3% that go in the same direction. Now, when we do the control, that is, we present both stimuli to match the previous stimuli, then you see that obviously all the responses go right, if that's what observers saw, or go down, if that's what observers saw. So the interesting thing here is that experimental condition is practically undistinguishable from the cardinal condition, that is, from the situation in which only downward motion was presented. And this is consistent with previous studies. Actually, Jeremy Wald was the first to use this protocol. It's consistent, no surprise. The surprise, and it was a surprise to us, came when we look at the eye movement. We saw that the eye movement, in this case pursuit, followed the average motion. Smooth pursuit is used by primates to center and stabilize the image of an object of interest to the fovea. So if we show observers only down, only motion, these are their traces. If we show the right same stimulus and the down orthogonal stimulus, now in blue you see the traces. And when we look at all the trials, about 3,000 trials, this is what you see. There's not a single instance in which the eye motion corresponds to the perception that people reported, to the orthogonal perception. As a matter of fact, when we average now the experimental condition, you see that it's completely different to what happens when people when people are shown only downward motion or only rightward motion. So far, there's clear evidence that we're not aware of information our eye movements reflect. Now the question is, can we modulate the representation strength of each, the aware and the unaware direction? And in order to study that, we resorted to feature-based attention, which is an endogenous or controlled system of attention that is known to improve perception and enhance the neuronal representation of the stimulus. So imagine that you go to a concert, there's a crowd there, and you're looking for your friend, and your friend tends to have a red jacket. So what happens is that you're going to be able to process selectively all the reds, and that's going to guide your behavior. And there's many psychophysical, neuroimaging, and electrophysiological studies that show that this is the case. So we took advantage of this endogenous phenomenon of feature-based attention, and we now combine it with a binocular rivalry flash suppression. So this is exactly what I showed you before. One stimulus is flashed. Now, before the two stimuli are presented, we're going to give an arrow to the observers. And in this case now, during these 500 milliseconds, in half of the trials, there's going to be a speed change. In half of the trials, for 100 milliseconds or so, the speed is going to accelerate. And we're going to tell observers that if the change happens, it's either going to happen in the right downward direction, in the left, or if they see the two arrows, then they know that that speed change is equally likely to occur in either of the stimulus. The first thing we do is we look at the prime. This is a sanity check, and we see an effect on attention on the orthogonal stimulus. Now the D prime, a measure of sensitivity, is higher for the orthogonal stimulus when it's attended than when it's not attended, as well as for the same stimulus. And the first thing we do is we replicate. So here we show that for the neutral condition, again, the perception is going to indicate the direction of the orthogonal pattern, but the pursuit is again doing this average motion. And we did many stimuli in which we follow different directions. We changed the stimulus, we changed the stimulus size, the stimulus contrast, and so forth. And in all cases, we found that perception follows the orthogonal direction. This is the orthogonal direction in these four different directions. And interesting pursuit, in this case, the average motion goes up in the two cases on the right. And in the two cases on the bottom, now pursuit goes down, regardless which was the orthogonal or which was the same stimulus. And that happens, now that's pure replication of the previous studies. Now what happens when we selectively attend? So if we attend to the orthogonal stimulus, now attention, the response is going to the orthogonal stimulus. Interesting, what we see now is that the eye movement follows the orthogonal stimulus. No longer the average direction, but the orthogonal stimulus. So now we have a match between the perception and the eye movement. Likewise, if now we attend to the same stimulus, the same one that was unseen or suppressed before, now we see that there's so many movements. I don't know what that is. There's so many movements toward the same when they were not present before. That the perception goes towards the same as much as it goes towards the orthogonal. And now the eye movements go toward the same stimulus. Again, having a match now between perception and pursuit. But that only happens if people selectively attend to one component. Are we supposed to be concerned about this noise?
I think somebody went out the door back there.
Okay, so no panic. Okay. So in the review, what we do is we put all experiments together in which we have a neutral condition. Okay, bring your attention back here. Okay. So I need 30 more seconds. Okay. So we put together all the trials in which observers were in a neutral condition without attention. And what we find is that people reported, that is what we call aware perception, the orthogonal stimulus over 98% of the time And at the same time, for the same trials, their pursued eye movement went in the average direction. So this is a very, very clear dissociation. And we show that feature-based attention affects both our perception and eye movements. So the same stimulus, which is suppressed in a neutral condition, becomes available to our perception. And we find individual level control that modulates the balance of the aware and unaware directions and action guidance. So pursuit no longer reflects the average motion direction, but more closely reflects the attended direction, whether it was the same stimulus that had been suppressed or the orthogonal stimulus. Now, this is a cartoon of a cartoon illustration, of course. There's no exact anatomical size and location, and there's only feed-forward connections, and not all areas implicated in eye movements are reported here. But what I would like you to see is first the red pathway, which corresponds to perception. This is a pathway that we know a lot about. We know that retina projects to the dorsolateral geniculate nucleus, and from there information is projected to V1, and then it's projected to other areas like MTMST, parietal areas like LIP, and frontal areas like frontal eye field. And from those areas, there's also projections to subcortical areas in the midbrain and brainstem. Now, in contrast, we have the blue pathway, and this blue pathway is the one that could mediate eye movements in the absence of awareness. This is a subcortical retinocollicular pathway. So information goes from the retina to the superior colliculus, to the columnar, and to MTMST, bypassing the LGN and V1. And it also has direct connections to frontal areas from superior colliculus and to LIP, as well as from the columnar. As a matter of fact, this is a system that is, better disclosed, thanks. Could you close the door? Thanks. This is a pathway that has been related to residual visual abilities in cortical or in patients that have blind sight. So just to summarize, I have shown you, and I propose based on those results, that eye movements are not only the window to cognition, they're also the window to perception, but even when stimulus-evoked brain activity fails to reach awareness. And relevant points to the debate that I want to bring up is just I want you to note that the stimulus had the same strength on both eyes, that there was matched performance through it was two different concurrent responses. One was an estimation task and the other was the eye movement. There's no criterion issue here. There was a similar observer's subjective experience for the same stimulus as for the absent stimuli, given that the response to the absent was to the same stimulus was about 1% of the cases. Observer side movements match stimulus motion average direction. That is, they are responding in a very lawful way, over 99% of the trials. And importantly, voluntary feature-based attention modulated both observer's perception and eye movements. And voluntary attention, I would say, that clearly fits the level of the personal level requirement. Now, in this case, eye movements reflected the average motion direction of aware and unaware information. Thank you. Is this not? No, it's you computer, no, don't disconnect.
Okay, so now that Marisa has argued the affirmative, that there is unconscious perception, we'll have two related talks arguing the negative, that there's not, and we will start with Akwan Lal, who's we start with Megan, who's a postdoc in consciousness and medical cognition lab at UCLA, so please welcome Megan.
Okay, so As Dr. Chalmers mentioned, I am a skeptic of unconscious perception, or at least one particular form of unconscious perception that I think matches what a lot of us think of as kind of the household version of what we think of when we talk about unconscious perception, and that is this blindsight-like behavior. Today's debate is really about whether or not there's such a thing as unconscious perception, and I want to start by talking about definitions. There's a lot of ways that we can define what counts as unconscious perception, and in particular, what counts as perception and what counts as unconscious. So I'm going to pick one of the definitions today to focus on. It doesn't mean it's the best definition or the only definition, but it is the one that I'm going to focus on today. So for something to count as perception, for the purposes of this talk, it's going to have to directly drive behavior. And for something to count as unconscious, it needs to be subjectively indistinguishable from the experience of nothingness. So for something to count as unconscious perception, the something that it is like to do the direct discrimination task must be subjectively no different from the something that it is like to do some sort of task on the basis of nothing at all. And like I said, this is definitely not the only way that you could define unconscious perception. You could define it as priming, for example, when direct discrimination would be at zero or at chance, where D prime would be at zero. And while that's a meaningful definition, and I think other people will talk about that today, this is the one that I'm going to focus on. And this is really the version of unconscious perception that I think comes to mind when we first think about it. It's this kind of idea that there is a subjective threshold for awareness, and that this subjective threshold for awareness is higher than the threshold for objective performance. And so this is kind of the blind sight-like behavior, right? That you can do some task on the basis of a visual input, for example, and yet you report no awareness of the stimulus. So like you see in blind sight patients, like patient GY. So the fact that we have blind sight patients shows us that it is conceptually possible to have this difference between the subjective threshold for awareness and the objective threshold for performance. And as Dave mentioned at the beginning, a lot of us here probably believe this is true, and I even used to believe that this is true. But it turns out it's not as easy to demonstrate as we might hope. And in fact, as I may convince some of you today, it may not exist at all. So wait a second, you're probably saying, we've got all these cases of masking. You can use various techniques to show a stimulus at near threshold contrast. Very briefly, you mask it with other images. And we all know that that can demonstrate cases where you have the ability to do some task based on visual input, but you report no awareness of the stimulus, right? Like, this is trivial. Everybody knows that this exists. But the problem here is the criterion problem, as Marissa just mentioned very briefly at the end. So usually the task that's used to demonstrate this type of behavior is that you show some stimulus and you ask an observer to make some sort of decision about this stimulus, and then you ask for a confidence or a visibility judgment on some scale. And the logic here is that if you have a high enough subjective signal, you as the observer will report, I saw the thing. These are what we'll call the conscious trials. And that if the subjective signal is weak, it's not there at all, then you'll say, I didn't see it, and these are the unconscious trials. And now, if we successfully induce performance above chance in this discrimination decision, in these trials, this counts as unconscious perception, right? You can do the task, and yet you don't see the stimulus. But the criterion problem tells us that, of course, there is this third option, which is that the subjective signal was there. It was just too weak to pass some sort of internal threshold or criterion for reporting, being willing to report that you saw the stimulus. So these weakly subjective trials will get lumped in with the trials that you actually didn't see anything. And then, of course, you can do the task above chance, and this is no longer interesting now, right? Because this is just weakly conscious perception. This is not unconscious perception, and that's really what we're interested in inducing here. So what we need to do is we need to fix this problem. So instead of doing a task like this that's reliant on some sort of internal criterion or threshold, we'll use a two-interval forced choice. And we'll ask the observer to make two decisions. So if there's a stimulus, make a decision about it. There's another stimulus, make a decision about it. And now we say, which of these decisions are you more confident in? Or which stimulus did you see better? And the idea here is that this totally removes any reliance on some internal threshold or criterion for being willing to say, I saw the thing, or I am confident in that stimulus. And so what we do to use this kind of technique to look for truly unconscious perception is we will actually replace the target in one of these intervals with nothingness. So now we show you a target and we say discriminate this thing. And then we show you nothing and we say discriminate this thing. And the idea here is that if doing the direct discrimination task on the basis of the target when it is there is subjectively or introspectively no different from doing the task based on nothing, then you will say 50-50 when we say which one are you more confident in. You'll pick this one half the time and this one half the time. And then this would be a really conservative demonstration that there truly is unconscious, not just weakly conscious perception. So we ran this task where we show an oriented Gabor patch here, and you say, is it tilted left or right from vertical? And we mask it with forward-backward masks. And then in the other interval, we show nothing, and of course we counterbalance these, right? And then we show the target at up to 13 different contrast levels, so we can measure the entire psychometric function of performance. And then we ask observers, which of these two decisions will you bet that you got right? And with this task, we can have a really clear indication of whether we've actually induced unconscious perception. So if we plot the orientation percent correct on the x-axis, so this is when the target is actually present. And then on the y-axis, we plot the percent of time that you bet on the decision that you made when the target was actually there. If we're successful in inducing truly unconscious perception, we should see something that looks like this. And the flat part is what we're interested in. So this flat part would be cases where you can do the task above chance, the visual input is directly driving your behavior, and yet doing so is subjectively or introspectively no different from doing the task based on nothing at all. So you're betting 50-50 on the two intervals. So this is what we're looking for, right? But this is what we find in 3 experiments. So the idea here is that if we ask about confidence or we just ask about the visibility of the target, if we change the order of the questions, we provide feedback or we don't provide feedback. Basically, as soon as you can do the task above chance, you have the ability to bet meaningfully on your choices. As soon as you can do the task, you can see the target. And if you're worried that forward-backward masking was not the right way to induce this type of behavior, we also did it with continuous flash suppression, and we found the same behavior. And it turns out that if you build a Bayesian ideal observer, a computational model that does this task, so it makes an orientation discrimination, and then it does the same thing based on no target, and then you make it bet on which one it's going to get right based on the posterior probability of its choice, you get the same behavior. So not only is this not blindsight, it's optimal. Basically, people are completely optimal at doing this task. And this was really surprising to me. I really thought that I would be able to induce unconscious perception using these masking techniques that everybody knows is supposed to induce unconscious perception, right? So if masking doesn't work, we should probably try something else, maybe something that's a little bit heavier handed. So maybe let's try TMS. So previously it's been shown that if you show someone a target and you ask them to discriminate it and then you zap them in the visual cortex, that you can create conditions where they can do the discrimination above chance, and yet they report that they don't see the target. And so we ran this with our 2-interval forced choice in collaboration with Tony. I just saw him in the audience. So here we present the target and we zap you, and then we're comparing it again to nothingness. So we're asking the same question. Is doing this task based on a target that you get zapped with subjectively or introspectively different from doing it based on nothing? And the answer is yes, it is, but it's not optimal anymore. So now we get a completely different pattern of behavior. So this was our ideal observer, our optimal behavior, and now we're seeing something different. So TMS is actually really messing up your ability to do any sort of introspection on your decisions, but it is not completely knocking out awareness of that target. So there's still something that it is like to do the discrimination task based on that target when it's there. It looks like neither masking nor TMS will actually do the job here to create this blind sight-like behavior, at least not the way we thought it would, right? So we use different masking techniques, different techniques to render a stimulus unconscious that all should have worked in a very particular way based on previous studies, but they didn't. Once we fix the problems with the task, the effect appears to change or go away entirely. So this finding actually does fit with the more traditional kind of industry standard theories of what it means to be conscious of a stimulus in the first place. So if we go back to the basics, to signal detection theory, we'll recall that the traditional way of deciding whether a stimulus is unconscious is to look for D prime is 0 or chance performance, right? And this is the benchmark that priming studies use. If your unconscious prime can be directly discriminated above chance, then it doesn't count as unconscious. And it seems like maybe that's the definition that we should go back to, that as soon as you can discriminate something above chance, you actually have some introspective ability about that, or there is something that it is like to do that discrimination decision. So traditionally, we were skeptical of whether you can get blind sight in normal observers. It looks like that skepticism may have been warranted. So we need better evidence that this type of thing exists for me to believe in it. So the last thing that I want to say is, okay, well, I've shown you a bunch of stimulus manipulation techniques or brain manipulation techniques, but what about actual blindsight patients, like patient GY? Blindsight patients, they report no visual awareness of a stimulus, and yet the visual inputs can directly drive their behavior. But you'll notice that I said they report no visibility of the stimulus, right? So we don't actually know how patient GY or any other blindsight patient would do in this particular two interval force choice paradigm. And in fact, if you read the literature, you run into type 2 blindsight, which is that there's something that it's like, it just may not be visual in its qualia. So until we test these patients with this particular paradigm, or we train monkeys to be able to do it so we can test them, I'm going to remain a skeptic of whether this blindsight-like behavior actually exists. So that's really all I want to say today, to maybe plant the seed of doubt in the mind that this type of behavior can be induced. So with that, I'll hand the baton to Hawkwon. Thank you.
So I think it's a big danger in this debate that we'll end up with just shouting at each other about what definition is the best. And I think Megan kind of nicely pointed out there are different definitions here, and they're adopted in different talks. So you can actually assume. So you can actually take Marissa's definition that it, so long as it has some sort of invariant representation of the world, it doesn't actually have to drive the agent's directly behavior. So you have some sort of indirect evidence, some sort of priming evidence, or in Marissa's case, it's better is actually your eye movement, but it's part of you that reflected or that represented that. It's not that you as an agent endorse those information, right? So there's a different kind of evidence that we sometimes take. In the case of, let's say, blindsight, you can actually ask the patient, if I present to you some unconscious information, can you press the key to tell me what is more likely to be the stimulus? And the subject would be able to basically press the correct key, as if giving a speech act endorsing certain properties of the stimulus. And so that's one dimension, basically what kind of evidence you want to count as perceptual evidence. Do you just want to have some sort of perceptual representations in part of you, in just your oculomotor system, or do you want your person as an agent to be able to directly do things to reflect that information? And I think that these are both fine definitions, and it's hard to say which one is better, and I'm not going to say the other one is completely meaningless. But if you actually take the indirect priming kind of evidence as enough, or just part of your body representing unconscious information as enough, then it's basically not very, it's not a very interesting debate, because I think most people would already agree that there is unconscious perception in that sense, no matter how you define unconscious perception. So again, that gets back the other dimension of how you define unconscious perception. You can define it as what Megan has argued about. You can define it as D prime has to be 0. That is, when you do a direct task to discriminate the stimulus, you have to have 0 sensitivity. And that is actually traditionally the definition. But if you take that definition, of course, then it cannot possibly directly drive your behavior in the same sense. B prime equals 0 means, you are basically have 0 signal to noise ratio. And even if it drives your eye movement, it's not driving you as a person that you endorse the stimulus, because that basically is shown with B prime. So that may be not something we want to talk about. And the thing that we really want to talk about here is these kind of cases where you present some stimulus that you subjectively don't think that you don't say you see it, but actually it directly drives your behavior. So that's really the classic blindside situation, right? The blindside patients say that they're blind after V1 lesion. They say that they don't see anything. They may genuinely don't see anything. We don't really know. But then when you ask them to make actually speech acts, make button presses to actually say what the stimulus is, they can do it about chance. And why this is important, right? So you might say, well, I'm not interested in that. I'm only interested in the other kind of definition. Then you're fine. But I think you have to ask them, why did we fight so hard back in the 80s about the existence of blindside? Remember, in the 80s, people really fought tooth and nail over the existence of blindside. If this doesn't matter, why does it matter, really? So why don't we just settle with the other case, then you don't even need to talk about blindside, and blindside exists or not, doesn't matter. I think blindside matters actually for reasons that are more than just what we talk about here. It's not just historical, we want to get a credit, and it's more than just these definitions. Blindside is actually a very unique kind of unconscious perception, even if you allow the other kind, because usually when you do masking or all the other kinds of situations, you have a tiny, tiny signal. And that signal, when it's very weak, and of course you have some behavior, some priming behavior and something like that. And that's really not very interesting. And this is a point that actually has been expressed by people who study binocular rivalry. When you study binocular rivalry, it's the holy grail of consciousness studies, because the physical stimulus is the same and your mind changes. Yes, but is it really your conscious mind that changes, or is it just some signal in the brain that fluctuates? So here's a paper recently. So this point is expressed by, I think David Hegers has written about it, and he's probably the one who knows more about binocular rivalry than anyone here. And other people actually recently have done a study that really reinforced this point to show that even unconscious stimuli actually rivals in the brain. So just because some signal fluctuates in the brain doesn't really mean very much. It could be just the fact that signals are strong, some signals are weak. When signals are weak, of course, you're not very conscious of it. And blindside is interesting because you have a very powerful signal. Not just your eyes can jitter to reflect the signal, not just part of your brain represents a signal. You as a subject actually have the signal. You can use it. You can actually use it to do behavior. You can use it to press buttons to do things. But at the same time, you're subjectively meant to be blind. The problem with blindside is, of course, that it's very controversial. So I grew up academically. I grew up in England when I did my PhD. When I heard about these debates, so Alan Cowie and Seiboseki would argue for decades about whether blindside patient GUI said this or didn't say this or said this in this context or who reported that and that, etc. So Porteous Party is supposed to have cleaned up a lot of that by applying signal detection theory. But I'm going to say we are probably the other group that also use signal detection theory to study that, and we don't agree with him at all. So even those issues are not easy, it's not straightforward. I mean, how to apply signal detection theory to blindside, how to interpret those data is nowhere nearly a trivial matter. So recently we think we cracked this. So I moved away from the patient work since then, and I really have been trying to find a way to induce a very strong signal in your brain that is not just a priming, a masked out signal, it's really a strong signal directly in your brain. And this is a way we can actually now do it. So it's a couple of papers we published last year. It's a method called decoded neurofeedback. So traditionally, neurofeedback has a lot of replication issues. In the case of fMRI, it's really not very clear whether you can actually change the fMRI signal by, usually it doesn't change that much, the fMRI signal. But here, we first use multivariate decoding method to decode the spatial patterns of a local area. We're not just trying to get people to upregulate or downregulate a whole area. We first decode what is the content of an area by using machine learning methods. And then we monitor that online when people are in the scanner, and we decode the brain patterns and try to read out, okay, this time the subject is likely, the visual cortex is representing something like a spider. And then we feedback that signal to the subject visually and say, okay, you're doing the right thing, keep doing it. If you keep doing this, I'll give you more money and more money. So people can actually then activate a very strong signal, read outable by fMRI. You can use fMRI to read it out at like 80% correct. So it's a big signal. And you might think you now have a big signal in the brain, maybe you can have blind sight. So it's not just a tiny mask signal. And in fact, we can use it to do a lot of stuff. And in one of these papers, you can use it to modulate representations of confidence. You can do that in the frontal parietal cortex. That's a Cortese et al. Paper. And in the other paper, we can actually do this kind of fear conditioning study. We can actually get you to activate a representation of an object that you're afraid of. And every time you do that, I give you a bit of money. And then pair the negative object, the feared object, with a positive feeling, so that can actually get you to become less afraid of the object. So in other words, Clockwork Orange is coming at you. So this is really powerful stuff. So we thought, this is great. We can now have blind sight. But when we actually measure the subject's subjective awareness, they have no idea what's going on. They just thought they're going in the scanner, trying to do some mental training and get money. When we ask them whether you think you're activating spiders or snakes, they have no idea. They cannot guess it. They cannot do single trial level. We've just started doing it. They also guess it a chance. They are nowhere like blind sight. So that's another disappointment that like Megan, we used to believe in this stuff. That's why we study it. But actually, we keep getting disappointed. And I think we kind of come to think that it probably makes sense because it is known that consciousness depends on frontal parietal circuitry, right? So it is. This is our view, and in the lab for a while. So BU has also shown other evidence. So if that is true, if conscious perception depends on frontal parietal decision-making like circuitry, it would all make sense because for you to have unconscious information that goes into your frontal parietal area, it's very hard because by the time you get there, you probably become conscious. So in our neurofeedback procedure, we are only trying to activate visual signal in the visual cortex, and they don't go to the frontal parietal areas. And of course, if you don't go to your frontal parietal areas, it doesn't drive your action, because your frontal parietal areas is the interface between perception and action. It's a sensory motor transformation circuitry. So if you don't go there, you cannot, does not drive your agent level action. It might drive some subcortical and then go to your eye movement level like Marisa talked about. But as a person, if you want to press button and choose meaningful action, you need to go to these areas. And also, Mike Shetland here at Columbia have shown that these neurons also rate confidence. So if you want to introspect when you're seeing something or not seeing something, you also need this circuitry. And in fact, in that paper that I talk about where you show unconscious binocular rivalry, in fact, that also is a clear absence of frontal parietal activity when the rivalry is unconscious. When the rivalry is conscious, then it goes to your frontal parietal areas. So all of them seems to make sense. This is not to say you can never have dissociation between consciousness and your action. You probably have some at near threshold situations. When we do psychophysics, we can get them near the threshold, we can do something like that. But if you want to completely knock out conscious percept and have unconscious direct action, that probably is very unlikely. So, thank you.
Okay, arguing the affirmative, give it up for Ned Luck.
Sorry about this, it's a switch of computers.
You're not looking at a conscious machine,
All right, so I am going to take a completely different tack. So Hackwell and Megan are talking about totally unconscious perception. You know, the idea is shaving off every bit of consciousness from a percept and still having some perception left, unconscious perception. I'm talking about something totally different, where the subject sees something, but there's some aspect of it that can guide their behavior that they are not conscious of. So the kind of thing they're talking about is like something like blind sight, which may or may not be totally unconscious. I'm going to talk about something else, and my what I'm talking about is very similar to what Marissa talked about, where it's not that the subject doesn't see anything. It's not, as in Megan's terms, indistinguishable from seeing nothing. So in Marissa's case, and the ones I'm going to be talking about, the subject is seeing something all right. There's just some aspect of it that the subject isn't aware of. So my first, I'm going to use two examples. One is visual form agnosia, where this is a brain damage in the so-called ventral stream of vision, where the subject sees something like this and says things like, she can see textures, colors, size, but she cannot see shape, or she cannot see much shape anyway. That's my focus. So these are the two visual streams, the dorsal and the ventral stream. The ventral stream is the standard unconscious stream. Dorsal stream has some closer relationship to action. This patient has this is a famous patient with a big lesion in the ventral stream. And here is a task developed by Miller and Goodale, where they contrast an activity of posting a card into a slot with one or another form of judging. For example, if you ask her, is that slot, if you show her a vertical or a horizontal slot and say, is it horizontal or is it vertical? She has almost no idea, not completely right. Here is, and matching is where she makes the angle of the slot with her hand without posting it, so it's a form of judgment. So this is a diagram of her degree of correctness, where the vertical is, everything is normalized to vertical. So this is what it looks like when you are a normal subject and you can do it right. This is what DF, that's this patient, looks like. So it's almost random. However, here is what she does when she posts. Almost as good as normal sight. So the idea here is that this near random behavior suggests lack of much conscious awareness of slant. Notice that I don't require zero conscious awareness of slant, because what I'm going to be arguing is that her visually guided action is partly unconscious. There's no need for this subjectivity different from zero. And this reflects a largely unconscious perceptual representation of the slant. So far, well, when Ian talks, we're going to hear more about this issue of the personal level, but I want to raise the question, because this is what Ian has alleged in a lot of previous earlier forms of this debate. So, and that is this unconscious representation really perception as opposed to the sub-personal processes underlying perception? So I'm really very suspicious of the personal, sub-personal distinction. I think most cases are probably indeterminate. In particular, I do not think that determinately personal level is a well-defined enough notion to postulate that it is a necessary condition of being genuinely perceptual. Nonetheless, even though I'm skeptical, I have proposed various sufficient conditions. I think there are more postulates or proposals about how to use language. And the one that's going to be relevant today is guides the person's action. So I think at least it's a reasonable way to use that term. I also have some other ones that I won't be able to get to today, which is engages the person's preference or needs, or engages the person's understanding. Some of you who know the literature may know what that thing refers to. So what I'm saying is this is at least partly unconscious because she has little or no awareness of the slant of the slot. And it's perception because it is perceptual guidance of her actions. Now, those of you who know any of this literature know that this is a topic that is reasonably considered a war zone. The people who've done this research are Goodale and Miller, and then these other people, Schenck, Thomas Schenck and Volker Franz, have objected to nearly everything they've done. Well, I should say with a really ad hoc group of different objections. And their objection to this one is this. they did an experiment with normal people where they had a different shaped slot such that the card could not fit in the slot in the normal way, but only diagonally. And then what they showed was that some normal subjects used a strategy of just trying to avoid hitting the slot. I'm a little skeptical about the logic of this, but in any case, this task was designed to elicit obstacle avoidance. It does not apply to the DF case that I just showed you, so I'm not impressed with this. So, in more detail about this, so this is from Milner and Goodale. They call, in one of their books, they call DFD. D moved her hand forward unhesitatingly and almost always inserted the card smoothly into the slot. Moreover, video recordings revealed that she began to rotate the card towards the correct orientation well in advance of arriving at the slot. And I have asked Goodale for some videos, which you are about to see. That's DF right there. And these are from 1990. So you can see that she rotates her hand before she gets to the slot. I won't show you the whole video, but I'll show you, I'll use up another minute of my time on that. I don't know why she doesn't pull her hand back. We'll do one more. Okay, so anyway, to sum up, I think that this is one thing to look at. Whether or not totally unconscious perception exists, I think that partly unconscious perception, that is when you're not conscious of a certain aspect of the percept, and I think it's not only in her, and I think it's in all of us, and I'll show you an experiment in a minute that suggests that. But first, I want to pre-refute Ian's objection to this. So he says in a recent thing, an alternative picture is suggested by the familiar metaphors of an automatic pilot, tele-assisted semi-autonomous robot, or heat-seeking missile. Such metaphors suggest that the only representations attributed to the individual, that is, its personal level, will be those associated with target and action type. So his picture is that she is in effect launching a ballistic missile at the slot. She's telling her unconscious visual system, put the card in the slot. But I don't really see any justification for that. You saw that there was moment-by-moment guidance. Does moment-by-moment visual guidance have to be conscious to be personal level? If so, that would be sneaking in the answer by the back door. And so here's my challenge to you. Is there any possible experiment that would show unconscious perception? And the reason I think that's a relevant challenge is if the real objection is a priori, then I think we should hear what the a priori argument is instead of talking about the experiments as if you were taking the experimental methods seriously. So I said that I think that that we all have partly, that all of our, basically I think that nearly every perception, every conscious perception has an unconscious part. But here is some data that suggests that our perceptual guidance of grip, that is where we pick something up with our fingers, is partly unconscious. So these are Efron blocks, which have surface area and brightness constant through all the blocks, although varying in width. So another Goodale experiment looked at people's ability to grasp the blocks at different degrees of visual angle, where that's 0, this is 5 degrees, this is 70 degrees, this is 90 degrees. So if you just put your hand at 5 degrees and 70 degrees, I think you will see that you can see 5 degrees pretty well, but you really have a hell of a time with conscious perception of 70 degrees. So they asked people to do these gripping, and they also asked them to give numerical judgments. I think that the blocks were numbered, and they did numerical judgments, and here are the graphs. So what you find is, for numerical judgment variance, this is 70 degrees, this is 5 degrees, you see a big decay in the periphery of vision, but you don't see that comparable decay for grip. So their grip, and this makes sense because the dorsal visual system feeds is much stronger in peripheral perception than the ventral conscious visual system. So it makes sense that it would do a much better job in the periphery of vision than the conscious system. So that suggests the guidance of grip is partly unconscious, especially when you get into the periphery of vision. And here's a little diagram of the visual system with 3 sort of parts of the visual system labeled in terms of whether they're conscious or relatively unconscious. So the paradigm conscious is the so-called ventral stream. The dorsal stream is at least less conscious or maybe totally unconscious, and the same for subcortical pathways. So the conclusion is, whether or not we can produce blind sight-like cases, it's not that hard to produce these cases of partly unconscious perception. So I think no one has given any reason to think that eliminating conscious aspects must eliminate the action-driving role. Now I still have a few minutes left, so I'm going to quickly shift topics completely and talk about arthropods. Okay, this is the famous jumping spider. And this is a very visually capable creature that can visually identify its prey, track it. It can circle around and ambush the prey and accurately jump on it, all in service of its goals. And it has size, shape, direction, distance, and location constancy. Now, what I say is those abilities are sufficient for perception. But if perception is constitutively conscious, as some views, maybe Ian's view thinks, that where you think of perception as a kind of conscious acquaintance, this is the view of that philosophers will be familiar with, so-called naive realism. If it's constitutively conscious, then the question of whether the jumping spider is seeing depends on whether it's conscious. But it doesn't depend on whether it's conscious. It's seeing because it's a functional notion. Perception is functional, and we know from the fact that it has the functions that are described for the jumping spider that it's perception. So it refutes, the example really helps us with something we should have known anyway, which is that perception is not constitutively conscious. Now, Ian has replied to this. Actually, he's replied to a version of Tyler Burgess, not to me. This example of the jumping spider has been much explored by Tyler Burge. So Ian says the fact that we can know a state to be perceptual without knowing whether it's conscious no more shows that perception is not constitutively conscious than the fact that a young Lavoisier knew rain to be water without yet knowing it to be H2O shows that water is not constitutively H2O. But I think that the analogy doesn't work because perception is functional. So the key thing here is that the visual abilities of the jumping spider are sufficient for perception but not for consciousness. So perception is not constitutively conscious. And I actually have a few more seconds, so I'm going to say
12 seconds.
12 seconds, yeah. Okay, so in a written thing, Ian makes a lot of the fact that Milner and Goodale themselves say that vision, what is controlled by the dorsal system, is not actually perception. However, in the same passage in which they say this, they make it clear that they are just stipulating a usage for the word perception. They say we do not wish to imply that our usage is better, just that it's different from that adopted by some other writers. And their use of the word perception is to refer to mental representations that potentially could reach conscious awareness with slightly different stimulus parameters. And it's just one way of using the term, and I think we should not use the term in a way to preclude a real question.
Okay, so,
I believe I'm the only one so far to come in under time.
no, you were 30 seconds
Or
over.
maybe more. Okay, well, this shows the moral superiority of the pro.
I'm myself.
Okay, for our last speaker, all the way from Oxford, Ian Phillips.
You know how to get us to. Or
So PC.
okay, so thank you so much to David and to Ned for organising this and for all of you for coming. So in my 15 minutes, what I want to do is try and make a case that although there's lots of information processing and motor activation, all of it very interesting that goes on outside of conscious awareness, there really is a good case that there's no such thing as unconscious perception. And in particular, what I want to claim has been anticipated, is that all of the information processing and motor activation and so on, which goes on outside of consciousness, doesn't count as individual level or things done by the subject, and so shouldn't count as perception proper. So hence my Dylan-inspired title, But It Ain't Me. Okay, so the target thesis that I take it that Ned and I hope Marissa too think is correct is that perception in the ordinary sense occurs unconsciously. And I think putting it that way raises the obvious issue of what is perception in the immediate sense, and that issue should really be pressing because all the cases that we have of unconscious perception, allegedly anyway, alleged cases of unconscious perception, they're kind of manifestly unordinary. And that's not just because they involve extreme presentation conditions or often brain damage of one kind or another. It's because they lack a feature that's present to or strongly associated with perception in all the ordinary cases, namely consciousness. So the kind of thing you typically find in a lot of approaches to this issue is that we start with some kind of definition of perception and then go from there. So I think that's a mistake, and I think it's a mistake because it kind of faces a kind of dilemma. So I want to illustrate that with two examples. So the first is from a recent paper by Bob Kentridge. It's a kind of robust defense of unconscious perception against people like me. And he wants to start out with an experience-neutral definition of perception to get that going. And to define such a definition, he looks to the Oxford English Dictionary, and this is what, or part of what the dictionary says. Perception is the process of becoming aware of physical objects, phenomena, etc., through the senses. And in line with that definition, he goes on, I adopt a working definition of visual perception simply as the process through which we become acquainted with the visual properties of objects in the world. But I think kind of fairly obviously, there are two problems with this approach. The first is that we're moving to a sort of tight circle. I mean, specifically, I want to know what the definition of awareness is, what the definition of acquaintance is. I don't think we're any further along. But the other thing is both of those notions arguably imply consciousness. Awareness is often used as a synonym, as we'll see. So there's not only the danger of not really getting anywhere, but there's also a danger of sealing off the issue against unconscious perception, against what Cambridge wants to do. So that's one of the dilemma that we're not really getting anywhere, and we potentially seal off the issue. Well, the other horn, by looking at a definition that's given by Nancy Kawisher in her discussion of unconscious perception, that she starts out by saying, if the scientific investigation of awareness is different from the scientific investigation of perception, then the two phenomena must not be identical. And goes on to say, in keeping with this possibility, the word perception will be used to refer to the extraction and or representation of perceptual information from stimulus. So two issues there. I mean, firstly, I think that's a big if. It's just not obvious to me why we should think of these things as different. Why not, as Dave mentioned at the beginning, take the traditional view, for what that's worth, that perception is just a way of being conscious. And then, of course, the investigation of perception is going to turn out to be an investigation, at least partial investigation of consciousness. But the more important thing is that I don't know what reason we have for thinking this is a definition of perception in the ordinary sense. And that doesn't seem to be totally obvious, and if it's not, I think it would be entirely reasonable to say, well, I think you've just changed the topic and now you're talking about some technical notion and not speaking to my original concern. So I think a more fruitful approach potentially is to think of perception as kind of like a natural kind or a psychological kind. So this is the kind of approach I take it that Tyler Burge takes. So we think of perception as a distinct psychological kind that allows us to, for example, get our grip on perception through its conscious instances, but then leave it to empirical psychology to determine the nature of the phenomenon in question. I think Ned's view here, very much in sympathy with this kind of picture, is that what the empirical psychology then tells us is that the very same fundamental kind of thing goes on both consciously and unconsciously. So I don't want to directly challenge that view right now, I just want to point out that there's an alternative picture which we need to rule out. And on that alternative picture, we think that what psychology does for us is uncover psychological kinds which are constitutive, I mean, in the sense they constitute perception without being identical with it. So that would be an effect to deny that perception is a psychological kind in that sense, and think of it more like a manifest kind. If you know Mark Johnston's work, manifest kinds, think of that picture. So what does that get us if we think of it that way? Well, I guess just as you might think that a statue might be constituted by a lump of clay, and that be consistent with the lump of clay being there without constituting a statue in other circumstances, and they've already squished down. So too, you could think that the psychological processes that are uncovered by psychology as constituting perception in certain circumstances, well, those could occur without constituting perception in other circumstances. And if that's right, then this view is entirely consistent with perception being essentially conscious. So you just think of the cases of allegedly of unconscious perception as cases where those processes are going on, but they fail to constitute perception and also fail to be conscious. Okay, so how are we going to make progress? If both those views are on the table, I don't really see there's an easy resolution to this dispute. In the sort of second half, I kind of want to try and make some progress by focusing on a point of common ground. So this is the claim that you get in Burge, in lots of other places. It's kind of a shared view amongst the people on the panel today, that perception is something done by the individual. Okay? So here's Burge making that point. Informational states that are attributable merely to the brain or to some subsystem of the individual, they're not perception in the ordinary sense. Okay. So now I just want to look at some cases of so-called unconscious perception through that lens. So blindsight, I think Hakon was very nicely clear about this, is, I think, plausibly an individual phenomenon. Why do I say that? Well, because a subject like G.Y. here can respond to your question as an experimenter by saying whether that line is horizontal or vertical, say, or which interval the stimulus has been presented in. So they can voluntarily initiate manual or verbal reports. And that seems to me a good basis for claiming this is really an individual level phenomenon. But precisely for that reason, there's been a persistent suggestion going back right to the early 80s, as Hakon mentioned, that blindsight isn't really unconscious, that it's merely abnormal and degraded experience, unreported due to conservative response bias. So we immediately hit the problem of a criterion, which Megan and Hakon both talked about in these cases. So I'm not going to dwell on blindsight now. I was kind of not expecting it to be the thing that really matters, but I'm very, very happy to talk more about blindsight and why I think it's plausibly is thought of as a case of conscious but degraded and abnormal perception of DNA. I want instead to turn to where we need to go if we are sort of live to the problem of the criterion and think that cases like blindsight are not very clear cases of unconscious perception. So I think what we need to do is turn to cases where the subject has no ability to detect the stimulus in question. So we could go to the objective threshold and look for effects there. So effects where, in more technical terms, D prime or DA or whatever is different from zero. And I think there are plenty of priming effects at the objective threshold. I mean, I say that, I'm well aware this is a methodological minefield. So I'm just going to assume that's true. So here's one. From a paper by Klotzen and Lyman back in the late 90s. So you get a prime, which is a rectangle or a diamond, and that's masked, a meta-contrast masked by a target. The task is simply, it might be your task to say on which side the rectangle is, and then you just press, in this case, the right-hand key. And so these primes, even when undetectable, so d prime is 0, influence the responses to the target. So when they're congruent, when the rectangle is preceded by a congruent rectangular prime, the response time is marginally but significantly faster, and accuracy is improved, and vice versa for the incomplete primes. So this looks like a case you might think of unconscious perception. Well, the key question again is this really perception? So what to say about that? Well, this is what Klotz and Neumann say. They say, this is going to sound rather familiar, I think. Perceiving is something that a person or an animal does. The triggering of a sneeze by an external stimulus does not imply that the reflex center that controls it perceives the stimulus. Similarly, the activation of a manual response by a stimulus that cannot be consciously discriminated should not be called perception. So their view of this case is that what's happening is that the motor system is being directly activated by the prime, okay, it's what they call direct parameter specification, but that activation of the motor system by the prime should not be counted as perception, and their basis for that is that the subject can't consciously discriminate the prime. So, of course, building unconscious now looks like it's being some kind of question maybe, but I'm not sure we need to put conscious in there. We just need to talk about the capacity of a subject to use a representation to mediate a discriminative response. So if we say that, we can say the criterion of individual attribution is that the representation in question is only going to be attributable to the subject if the subject can use it to mediate a discriminative response. And here we have a couple of things to say about that. The first thing is, in a lot of these cases, clearly some level of representation is occurring, of a diamond or a rectangle, say. But just because that's so, and the subject's being affected in their actions by such a representation, doesn't mean that the subject is using that representation to guide their action. So some evidence for that, I think, comes out when you look at the ways in which unconscious priming effects are widely held to be insensitive to the subject's intentions and expectations. Snodgrass and Chevron in a paper finding a very interesting effect, talk about these influences being radically uncontrollable by the subject. So the subject, in fact, in their task performs worse than chance due to the primes, completely against their intentions. So their responses are being affected by the primes, but arguably they're not using them to mediate their responses. Okay, so here we get to the argument which I'm entirely happy to be called a priori. I just think it's an interesting line of thought, which engages in ways with the ways that scientists are thinking about these issues. That if you take this criterion seriously and you think you don't have perception in the ordinary sense, unless your representation is usable by the individual to mediate a discriminative response. And further, you make the move that I think is a more or less empirical move that says, well, whenever you've got such discriminability, you also have detectability of the stimulus. And you're thinking that detection suffices for there to be conscious awareness, then you have an argument that takes you from any genuine instance of ordinary conscious perception via the requirement that the subject be able to discriminate the stimulus, further to the thought that they can do that, they must be able to detect the stimulus. I mean, not just say yes, they saw it, but actually have some underlying capacity to detect the stimulus, to the idea that all perception is conscious. Okay, so final slide. What about vision for actions, and what about the cases that Ned was pressing? So I don't need to talk about what this picture is. So I think the issue here is whether the kind of fine-grained, or I mean, in those videos, of course, they look rather substantial, but I'm not sure whether they're fine or not really matters. Do the adjustments that subjects make in these experiments constitute discriminations by the individual? And I think there is a serious alternative picture here to consider, which is that what the individual does on the basis of their perception, conscious perception, depending on who you are, is to select a target, select a slot, select a kind of action type, namely posting, and then delegate the details to a subsystem, dorsal parietal system. And the teleassisted robot idea, that's Milner and Goodell's way of thinking about what D. Fletcher, so DF, is doing in these cases. They think that that's the appropriate metaphor, and I don't think that's to do with the way they define perception. I do think we should take that picture seriously, even though in the particular video cases it looks like a very strange thing to say. Well, it's a very strange case. So for us, I think our grip modulation may well be partly guided by affected causally by representations in our visual motor system. But we shouldn't think of those representations as genuinely perception, genuinely individual level. I mean, it shouldn't be a particular surprise that there are aspects of us which affect the way we act, which don't count as our own representation. So in some sense, one way of putting it is that there's a certain description under which this is an intentional action, for sure. That doesn't mean that all aspects of it and all modulations of it count as genuine subject level actions. Okay, so one way in which this ties back to the point about priming is just that if you look at work, for example, this paper by Biseller and colleagues on the dorsal-parietal system, it turns out it often functions in ways that goes against the way what the subject wants to do. So this might be an experiment where the target will jump, the subject's told when the target jumps, I want you to stop acting. Instead, what happens is the subject's hand continues on and moves towards the jump target, and the subject expresses profound frustration that their hand has done this. So I think there's some evidence there that we've got the same thing going on in the priming as in this case, at a very general level, and that we should think of these subsystems as not us. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, let's get all of our debaters up here. Okay, maybe we can start by seeing if anyone on the panel has questions for each other. That's all we got. Yeah.
Yes.
So, thanks for very nice presentations. The first thing that I wanted to say is that I think it's really good to be skeptical. And I actually, I think my work is known for actually being skeptical about a bunch of things. And as I said, I came to this through the side door because we were not trying to address these issues. That's why our experiments don't even have a criterion issue. Not only don't have a problem, they don't have a criterion issue, period. So I think that's something that I would like the audience to be quite aware of. The second thing, which I think is really important, and I like the eLife paper very much, it's a strict criterion that you're posing, and I think that's very good. And I think that we all would agree that there's several instances of studies that have claimed to show unconscious perception that probably have one of the problems that you and others have mentioned. However, I think it's interesting to notice that the evidence, and again, we wanted to study the feature-based attention effects on perception and eye movements, and Miriam stumbled upon these findings. She came to my office and she said, look at what the eye movements are doing. What do we do now? Like, this is literally the way it happened, right? And she was terribly disappointed because that meant that she couldn't do the project she came to do. And I said, wow, that seems interesting. Let's explore that. And we took a detour and we explored this for a year. And we did all possible manipulations, and the effect kept coming on and coming on and coming on. Now, what we showed is that subjectively, actually, there was no difference with the absent stimuli. The people, 99% of the case, reported one stimulus, not the other. And I think they only, and I agree with many of the issues that later you two brought up in the debate, But I think that one thing was disregarded, and also I would be curious about Ian's take on this, and that's the effect of the agency, the fact of the agency. And I think that's why the feature-based attention study, which is the one that actually we wanted to do at the beginning, when we thought that perception and the eye movement were going to go together. If I think about agency and I think about attention and selective processing of information, this is a very endogenous case. There's nothing reflexive about that. So to me, and the little that I read about this, it actually fits the bill. So I would like to hear what your take is on that. The other thing that
Yeah, maybe that's
oh,
not
sorry,
it.
can I just mention one thing?
You already had two things.
Oh.
Look, it's extremely brief.
Well, it's, I think before they reply, it's just something that is important to know that, so when there were no instructions for the observers regarding what to do with the eye movements in the studies that I showed. When we did instruct them to not move their eyes, they actually moved them, and just like we told them, just in the same way, that was 84% of the trials. And in one of the 8 experiments, we actually said, well, track the movement you see, then 99% of the trials give you the eye movement, but it's a pursuit eye movement. It's not ballistic. And I think that's something that I would like to hear your comments about. Pursuit, by definition, is not a ballistic eye movement.
Make it not
Yeah, thanks for the comment. I think that's right. I think you and I actually we probably don't disagree that much. That was my clumsy attempt at drawing the table and trying to say we are really, because when I drew the table, I didn't know that you were presenting that. I thought you were presenting some other work which you've done, the CFS or some of the kind of masking. So I think it's fair to say the work you presented today bypassed the criterion issue, but I think all of us have in the past, including myself, have done work that actually exactly fall prey to the criterion issue. So that's why I think it's one thing worth talking about. So it's not just for us whether we believe it, right? It's for the whole field. So for the whole field, the criterion issue is a pretty damning and somewhat shocking problem. And I think when it comes to the pursuit, I probably should let Ian say more, but I still think that even what you tell them to do is one thing, but usually when it comes to an action, if you ask a blindsight patient, you guess the line is left, okay, can you repeat again what did you guess in words? They would exactly say what they pressed the button, and because it's a subject level, personal level endorsement. I mean, it's endorsement with very little confidence, but it's something that is basically a speech act. And I'm not so sure in the case of eye movement is exactly like that, even in pursuit.
Yeah, I was asking the case of feature-based attention. Is
Yeah.
that can that be thought in any way as not an agency at the agency level? Something that I choose to selectively process information, which is what feature-based attention is.
I think in that sense, you and I totally agree that there are multiple visual representation in different parts of the brain and probably do different things. And I think that's okay. What we are really focusing on is just this one issue that can you completely knock out awareness and still have, agent level behavior. And the reason why we focus on that, I must say, is partly that's what we have been trying to do in Megan's case successfully recently, and what we've been trying to do for my lab for the past decade. And I think there's some reason for that. Is exactly address the tension between Ned and Ian here. So Ned posed a challenge to Ian about can you come up with an experiment, and then Ian also mentioned this is a case of blindsight. This is the critical, falsifiable, and in fact currently endorsed by most of the major players in the field, like Stan Dehan, Rafi Mala. I can name all the major players in the field of conscious perception. They actually believe the existence of blindsight in normal subjects. And that's one case is falsifiable, it's testable. It just turns out that in our own hands, when we came in, we went in for a surprise. So that's why we focus on that one case, which actually doesn't really contradict with what you do at all. Just your case is multiple representations in parallel, some are conscious, some are not.
But the action affects both of them. That's my point. The selective process of information of feature-based attention has access to both. It changes that balance. That's the point that I want to stress, because I think that's hard to not consider that is at the agency level.
I leave that to you.
Yeah.
So I guess one question I have is whether, so there are things that I think aren't individual level responses that the individual can affect. So it's part of what's going on that, so clearly to think that eye movements are subsystems which can do their own thing independently of the individual, but then the individual may do something that takes over and affects those. But how much of what you're saying is explained by just making that move?
Which move? Yeah. So what I'm saying is that the feature-based attention allows the access to what was unaware, in the sense that there was no perceptual report of it whatsoever. And now if you think in terms of weight, when the pursuit motion was actually the average of both stimuli, now it just gives weight predominantly to what was attended, whether it had been the suppressed stimulus or not. So I think that means that there was an agent there that, and if that information, if that representation was not there, you wouldn't modulate it, right? If it was not somewhat accessible, it would be hard to modulate it.
So, but why not think what's happened is that there's been information in the system that's now counts as individual level.
But why didn't it count as individual level before, when there is a match to the motion direction, right? So when the eye was pursuing the average motion, which is what one usually sees, the only trick is that we show one stimulus before, right? So it didn't move randomly, the eye, at all. It moved exactly as the vector average, which is what happens when you see that class, as I try to demonstrate. So it's not just an eye movement, it's not a ballistic eye movement, it's pursued. So I'm not sure that in that case why that would not fit the being of what you call.
So do you think the case is different from the case where DF is posting through the slot?
Well, DF knows that there's a correct response, right? And I'll let Ned respond there, but there is a correct response there. In our case, there's a perfect match to what was happening with the stimulus, even though observers were not asked to do that. Right? So there's a lawful relation with what the stimulation is.
Okay. So what
So if it was ballistic, right, I wouldn't have access to that representation through feature-based attention. Now, one can take the extreme and say, look, with neuropsychological patients, and I know you and others have taken that position, maybe you cannot generalize that much because there is a neuropsychological condition, and maybe the brain has rewired a little bit. So, that's a point that I think it's fair to claim. But in cases where there is no this neuropsychological condition, and you have now situations that really allow you to dissociate the responses, and yet to show that you have access to all of them, I'm not sure how the agency would not be met.
Yeah, did you want to come in?
No, I want to share. So I want to ask you the question I posed in my challenge. Can you think of any conceivable result? Maybe not one that an experiment that could be really easily done, but maybe any conceivable result that would show there was unconscious perception.
Blindsight existed.
I'm not asking you.
Yes,
I'm
I guess.
asking him.
I'm just giving him some hints.
Well, I guess I don't know how this is going to break ranks. It's not. So the argument I sort of sketched, which is I guess partly what you were hoping for, depends on a lot of pretty controversial claims. But if it's correct, then the answer is it's not obvious. Even if you accept that for it to be genuine perception, you've got to have discrimination, and that's going to be sufficient for thinking of the subject as consciously aware. Then no. But I think that actually my view is it's not obvious that it should count as sufficient, but it just means that we can't avoid the problem of the criterion. Once you've answered the problem of attribution, so there's a kind of, it's more of a skeptical challenge, but it's not like there's a test, I think, that's straightforward to be done.
So I'd like to see more about how this a priori is supposed to work. I doubt that a concept, ordinary concept of perception, is sufficiently determinate to ground any such claim that there can't be unconscious perception. We probably have a natural kind element in it, and that would be a reasonable way to go as far as thinking about unconscious perception. But I think we should open up the audience.
Okay, let's do it now. Questions? Okay, over there.
Great talks. So I have a question first and then a brief comment.
Just one.
Okay. So the question is to Megan and Haquan. So beautiful talks. So you got around the issue of criteria by substituting visibility with confidence measure. And whether confidence and visibility can be equated is in itself a heavily debated topic. And you seem to presume a certain information architecture between the two, while we currently really have a preliminary understanding of both of those. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on that approach. And a quick comment is, hearing about the debate, it seems that if we, from the neuroscientific perspective, it seems that if we substitute perception by processing, then the term of unconscious processing seems to be much less controversial. So,
Yeah, the question was really, can we equate confidence judgments with visibility judgments? So confidence in a decision versus just a visibility of a stimulus. And you're absolutely right that it definitely is controversial and that you could seriously argue that they're not the same. We did both experiments though in that paper. So we did one that was based on confidence and we did another one that was based on visibility. And we did them in different subjects and we got the same behavior in both cases. In this particular paradigm, it seems that confidence is either heavily reliant on a visibility judgment or that at least in this particular behavioral paradigm, they produce the same behavior. And then the TMS study, we actually just asked about visibility, so we got like a slightly different behavior there as well. But yeah, you can't necessarily equate the two, but in this paradigm, they produce equivalent behavior.
So on the second question, yeah, I think that if you stop talking about perception and instead talk about the processes involved in perception, you're not making the suspicious personal, subpersonal distinction, and of course then that whole issue disappears.
Frederic?
So thanks for this great debate. So it's mainly a question for those who are against unconscious perception. And the question is, do you believe in a degree of consciousness? So Megan says that consciousness could be weakly, something you said that there was a weak consciousness. And I was wondering whether if you agree that consciousness could be a matter of degree, whether that does not involve that the degree could be close to zero, and therefore there could be something like unconscious perception.
Sure, I think that the degree could be close to zero, that there could be degrees of awareness. So that's what you see in cases of like relative blind sight. So you can create two different stimulus conditions that produce the same objective performance or some other equated measure, and yet you have different degrees of responding, yes, I saw the thing, or different ratings of how visible the stimulus was. If that thing is close to zero, then yeah, you could have nearly unconscious perception. But for me, if you want to scientifically find, like, say, the neural correlates of consciousness, you really have to equate everything else and then have one case that is conscious and the other one that is not.
Well, but why isn't that just a degree of visibility with the same level of consciousness? That is, a weak visibility is conscious to the to the degree that all conscious stimuli are, just what's visible.
We don't disagree with each other. Go ahead. Yeah. You can do that.
Okay, sorry.
So, Ian, I'm a little bit worried that you're in danger of including things as perceptions that we shouldn't have in there. Because you pulled a very fancy move when you talk about DF and deflectress posting. And you say, look, in the normal case, what we do is we select the target and the action type and then just offload it. But people think they're orienting and guiding their hand. That's their usual belief about what they're doing, even though we think the timings can't be like that. So what about someone like Federer returning a ball? Patrick Kavanagh example, right? So Federer's returning the ball. He thinks he's keeping his eye on the ball the whole time. He is discriminating in a sense. He's guiding for action successfully, and his view is that he's detecting the ball at all times. But the ball's traveling at 110 miles an hour. There's no way he's tracking it with his eyes. Is he perceiving it? Is he perceiving it?
So arguably, in that case, no. It's just wrong about what's going on. So he has an overall task goal to return the ball and some maybe idea of how he's going to do that broadly.
But it meets your sufficiency condition in the claim that you had. You're attributing a perceptual representation only to someone if they're able to use it discriminatively, and then in the quasi priori argument you gave in reply to Ned, you'd think that would come with detection and consciousness, and he's got detection and consciousness. It just isn't accurate. So he's got all the awareness, he's discriminating in the right way, he's using some visual information, but it's not online as he thinks it is.
So I guess there are representations which are guiding the return, which don't count as individual level on the picture I was developing. And then there are other representations potentially, which may well be able to guide behaviour, like him reflecting on how he should play that shot better next time, for example, which are individual level because they can, so he can tell you afterwards where the ball was, or discriminate from a different shot. Then those representations are going to be individual level by that measure. But I do think that, for the reason you say, that we ought to be sceptical that everything in these sports equals tell us about what they're doing.
Okay, Haquan has a question for them.
So you guys asked some questions. I'm curious whether we also asked you one. I really like Ned's challenge about the empirical falsifiability. I think we have answered that there is a falsifiable case that is blindsided normal observers, and many people believe that. It was titled in papers, and we show that it was. If it turned out not our data was the opposite, then I think some of us would fall. So I want to throw the question back at you. So given that we know that there are multiple representations in the brain and at different levels, this is known in neuroscience, and given that many people assume that consciousness is unified, so you can be conscious of X but not X at the same time, given these two premises, are there any experiments that would show, that would falsify your claim that there is unconscious perception? Because if you can only be conscious of one thing at a time and you have multiple things in the brain that might not agree with each other, it seems to me that you are also loading the a priori dice. And it seems to me the same as in Marissa's case too. It seems to me you've got to find these kind of cases where your consciousness is X, but you have both X and Y in the brain, then of course the Y will by definition be unconscious. So how do you falsify yourself?
Gee, I don't really understand the question. I mean, I appeal to a bunch of experiments. If all those phenomena, that I was talking about, for example, gripping the periphery, if all those turned out to be, fake or something, that would certainly be evidence against the unconscious, partly unconscious perception.
I fear in that case you will find new cases.
Yeah, well, that's because it's true that there's unconscious perception. I've got some cases and no fake ones. So.
I am not certain that I understand the question, but there is no reason why in the cases that I show, the eye movement could have not corresponded to the perception. So it does not qualify that if it's X, then it's not Y. Because as a matter of fact, had you not present, that's why we have the control, right? And the control shows cases in which then the perception and the eye movement go hand in hand. So just a correction then on the question, the case that I qualify does not, I don't think it was intended to be asked. Or if it was, then tell me how. So.
I think your case is safe. What I mean is a general notion. So
Yeah.
given you have sometimes conflicting representations in the brain, and if you can only be conscious of one at a time, then the other one, of course, by definition, would be unconscious. So all you're saying that you believe there are conflicting representations in the brain, then that's fairly trivial.
But that's not what I'm saying.
Yeah, your experiments are
Okay.
fine. I'm saying that the notion in general that there is unconscious perception seems almost unfalsifiable.
Well, look, it's true that there are conflicting representations in the brain. Conscious perception is, by and large, a winner-take-all process. So there will, in almost all perception, there will be a winning stimulus or a winning interpretation of the stimulus, and that will fill your consciousness. But there will be suppressed interpretations that that can affect your behavior that don't. So if that's not an a priori truth, that's just a truth.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. Very interesting. I guess I may be mostly asking Ian because I kind of know Hak-Kwon and Megan's take on this, but I guess my take on all of this is that the criterion issue maybe isn't that big of a concern to begin with, because there are a lot of studies that show, of course, that the criterion can move around, but also that the criterion setting can also affect how you perceive things sometimes too. And so in that sense, I'm not really clear or convinced that much of this really demonstrates that there is a strict unconscious or no unconscious perception that's taking place.
Yeah, so I think that's really interesting. And that's part of why I was a bit hesitant in describing it as an argument where I endorse the various premises, because I think it's, if you take the kind of gold standard, anything above the objective threshold is counts as conscious, then there's a real problem. But if you're open to the idea that there might be cases of unconscious perception where D prime is higher than 0, then well, that opens up the possibility that there are. So that's precisely how blindsight is supposed to be, right? My basic thought is you can't, I mean, it sounds like I'm disagreeing with you now, but you can't avoid the problem with the criterion. But what I'm not saying is that the problem with the criterion rules out the existence of unconscious perception. I think it problematizes it. So we need to say something about what now, a reasonable view, it seems to me, is that there's no unconscious perception because you're cleaving to an objective threshold. But I take it to be equally reasonable to think that's not right. And the thing you said may be a reason for thinking that. Although I guess changing the way you perceive isn't quite the same as shifting between conscious and unconscious. Does that speak to what you were asking?
Thanks. This is a quick question for Ned. So Ned said that he thought that our ordinary concept perception wasn't really determined enough to sustain the sorts of a priori connections that Ian was proposing. I'd like to suggest the opposite view, which is that Ian's conception as part of a kind of richly structured notion of the subject, intuitive notion, if you give intuitive theory of notion of a subject at this person level, which I know you don't like, would be that perception is something that happens to the subject. You can then use that to make a discrimination. That's the subject using its exercise of intentional action. And that's why that first bit of his string of conditionals is true. It seems to me there's a richer structure there to articulate about what passively happens to the subject, what the subject can then act on the basis of what's happening to the subject. That sounds a very natural description of phenomenology, maybe illusory, but wouldn't that be a natural way of articulating a conception of perception that would make it determinate?
I think, as I said, I think there is a strong natural kind element in our concept of perception. Maybe our concept of perception isn't completely coherent. Maybe the element you described is in it as well. But the natural kind component would favor unconscious perception, the possibility of unconscious perception. The kind of thing that I actually think that the line of work that Marissa was talking about, which shows similar interactions between unconscious perception and feature-based attention as to conscious perception and feature-based attention, is yet another item of evidence that unconscious perception is in the same natural kind as conscious perception.
I've got a question for Megan and maybe Hak-Kwon. I mean, really hard to demonstrate unconsciousness anywhere. I mean, it's just it's very hard to know even exactly what the right test is. But I'm worried that the kind of tests that you guys are using is just extremely strong. I mean, the way, just to start with D prime, I mean, the way I remember back in the debates in the 1980s, where people thought that, okay, D prime equals 0 was the gold standard. If you could show that, that would be maybe sufficient for unconsciousness, but nobody thought it was necessary for unconsciousness. And it seems we can straightforwardly
at least imagine cases where there's unconsciousness, but positive D prime, as Ian said, that's how blindsight was supposed to be. Well, I mean, so it seems to me for the kind of criteria you were using of this kind of introspective discriminability, forced choice, is there something there? Is there nothing there? Maybe if you could show that that one comes out to zero, that would be sufficient for unconsciousness. But it seems extremely strong to say that's necessary for unconsciousness. If you get a positive result there and you get some kind of discrimination there, then that suggests consciousness. Because likewise, it seems perfectly straightforwardly imaginable there'd be unconscious representation such that when presented with these forced choice tasks, yeah, the existence of the unconscious representation makes a difference to your judgment, and you get what you're calling this introspective discriminability. So I don't know how you're thinking about it, but I mean, it looks to me as if at least all those results about introspective discriminability are completely consistent with unconscious perception in those cases.
So you're talking about, say, an unconscious hunch driving behavior instead of a conscious percept. I think that's
Or just an unconscious visual representation that makes a difference in behavior.
So you're saying that it could drive behavior even though it's unconscious. Well then, so by asking the subjects about an introspective question, then you fall into the same trap, I feel, with any experiment that would ever ask about a subjective experience at all, whether or not it falls prey to this criterion problem, right? So if you're asking the subject, are you aware or are you unaware of the stimulus, and they say no, then you're not demonstrating unconsciousness there either, right? So if you ask this subjective question, and you get something that demonstrates that there is a subjective difference from nothingness in any way, I do count that it's a very strong definition.
So, suppose you ran the same experiment. You got these two intervals, and you, instead of asking the subject is which interval is more visible or which interval you have the highest confidence, you ask the subject which interval is the most glug. Glug, just a nonsense word. I bet you get the same results.
I would be kind of surprised that you get the same result, but we haven't done it yet, obviously. But I think, in a sense, I would be surprised. I mean, no, you ask them, they would leave. But if to reply to Dave's point, I think it's very fair and very cute. But it really depends on how you look at it. I mean, one way to think of it is it really too much to ask to say, well, whether this stimulus looked the same as nothing? That is not a lot to ask. In a sense, it's pretty straightforward. And about the word whether it's too strong, I think it may be in a sense also too weak, because we know that indistinguishability is not the same as sameness. So even if people fail to distinguish two things, it may not mean that the experience is actually identical. So in the sense that it's also not exactly a very exhaustive claim, and we're just asking them, does it look like nothing? And if it's really unconscious, I think it's fair to say they should say, yeah, I can't tell.
But the fact that you're giving them this forced choice, and they have to say that one of them, the fact that it's forced choice seems to really make a difference here in the same way that it does in the deep prime.
Fair enough, yeah. So we would like to run at some point an experiment where it's not forced choice.
Yes, the orange.
This is a rather naive question. It's to the philosophers. It seems to me in this whole issue of unconscious perception, there are three elements involved in an operational definition. That is, that there's an actual stimulus, and there is an appropriate action or response, and a subjective report of not consciously perceiving that stimulus. Now, it seems to me that machines do that all the time. A sensor which opens the door does it, a Google car in a much more fancy way. When you drive, computer drives the car, it's doing that too. So, would you say that such intelligent machines actually demonstrate a kind of unconscious perception?
I don't think we have any machine that can do anything like what a jumping spider can do. But once we have them, it sounds a bit odd to describe something as unconscious perception when the creature doesn't have any possibility of conscious perception. But I think it would be the same thing.
This is also a question for Ned. Ned, this is about your sufficient condition for being person level, or representation being person level. So you said that if the representation is used in guiding action, then that's person level. And I was wondering how we should interpret representation guiding action, because not every behavioral part of an action is itself an action. Like I'm walking and maybe my step is an action, but my micro adjusting my ankle probably isn't an action. So I'm wondering whether whether we should interpret your condition as counting all of the behavioral parts of an action as being things that if a representation guided those, it would guide the action. Because if you counted it that way, then I can see why you'd say that every grasping, involves some unconscious perception. It's not obviously the right way to interpret the condition. So I'm wondering if you can clarify.
Gosh, I'd have to really think about that, but I'm not saying that there aren't some fine-grained aspects of an action that are maybe offloaded to a motor system, but so I don't really know how to draw that. Look, I offered that condition as a postulation. I'm not trying to say that there's some antecedent notion of perception that is sufficiently determinate to really justify it. I'm skeptical about the this personal subpersonal distinction, and if that's being a requirement, then
If you're skeptical in a way that makes it all person level, that's one outcome, and if you're skeptical in a way that makes none of it person level, it's a different outcome.
Okay.
Hi, this question's to Megan and Hakwon as well. A really elegant paradigm, I like it very much. And I was wondering, do you monitor autonomic responses at all? Because these can be powerful and reactive and potentially differentially responsive to the presence of something and nothing. They can also guide confidence, familiarity, liking and upper choice behaviours. And I was wondering whether you think this could be having an effect.
It's a great question. We haven't done it yet. It's on the list. In that sense, though, that if you have the ability to monitor your own autonomic reactions, that there's still something subjectively different about it, right? In response to the presence of a stimulus versus the absence of the stimulus. And so regardless of whether that subjective experience is a monitoring of a visual input or some other reaction that your body is having to that input, there's still something that it's like, right? So that would be my answer to that. I'm sticking to that really hard and fast line there.
Quickly say, it's also important that, so I'm very glad that Megan ran the control where you ask them to rate the comparison before you actually do the discrimination. Because if it's only after discrimination, you can say you're just monitoring how you feel when you do that. But people apparently can rate it even before they run the discrimination. It's not a complete rule out, but I think it does seem to suggest that there is another route that they can actually access without the autonomic monitoring.
Marisa, yes?
I would like just to add something again, because in our protocol, again, there was not an absent stimulus, rather there was the presence of two stimuli, and one of them was disregarded over 99% of the time. So to me, that feels like absence. And again, it's not a judgment about the absence, and I understand how complex that is, and again, I do agree with having a strict criterion. And I repeat, we bump into these phenomena, but it's really remarkable. 99% of the time, you ignore something that is being received by your eye. And concurrently, your eye is acting on it, not after you commit to a response. Right? So I think that's a really strong finding that really speaks a lot to this debate.
Henry?
Just a quick question for Ned. Regarding this idea that perception, almost all perception in everyone involves an unconscious element. If we grant that idea for the time being, it seems like there's a further question about whether you could ever have two perceptual states such that content that's conscious in one is unconscious in the other. And I just wonder whether you think the agnosia cases, the visual form agnosia cases, demonstrate that, because it seems like in the case of the agnosic patient, it's not that the ventral stream information is unconscious. It seems like it's not there, right? It seems that it's just absent. So what you have is you have a case where, in the normal case, you've got unconscious dorsal stream representations guiding behavior. And then in the ordinary patients, ordinary people without agnosia, you have conscious representations plus the unconscious ones. But you don't have a case where the same representation occurs consciously in one case and unconsciously in the other. So I just wonder if you think I'm interpreting that case right, or whether you think there is further evidence for the kind of case I have in mind.
So I'm not sure if I completely understand, but it's a common thing for unconscious visual representations to differ in content from the conscious ones. I mean, just one simple case is in flicker. So flicker above 10 hertz is seen as if you have a red and green flickering, it's seen as above 10 hertz is seen as a yellow color, but below 10 hertz is seen as red and green, but above is seen as yellow. But the early vision represents the flicker. Likewise, for very fine gratings above 50 cycles per degree. So that's just a routine thing for unconscious and conscious perception to conflict.
I have a question for Ian and possibly for Ned. I mean, I think it's very easy to get the impression that this debate about what counts as perception is to some extent verbal, using a particularly demanding notion of perception, and maybe it's somewhat different from the one that plenty of psychologists have been arguing about in their debate, which was more about whether there is unconscious processing, unconscious sensory-based representation that doesn't meet these criteria. So is there a way that the two of you, for example, can recast the debate between you without using the word perception? Like one debate that struck me as relevant was just whether unconscious processing, driven by vision or other sensory modalities, is you define the whole issue in terms of fundamental kind. Does unconscious processing share a fundamental kind with perception? Someone who's more loosey-goosey about perception might say, okay, sure, there's unconscious perception, but the question is it of the same kind as conscious perception? So, is it possible for you to recast the debate between the two of you in those terms?
There would be different debates.
Okay.
There would be one debate about personal level visual representation, and another debate about the same natural kind.
Okay, so there's a debate about whether unconscious processing and conscious processing are of the same kind, and there's a debate about whether unconscious processing has personal level availability. Is something happens at the personal level with personal level availability? Is that how you see it, Ian?
Yeah, I guess it makes assumptions to talk about processing being available and what's going on in the perceptual case as representation. So, I mean, Ned mentioned the evil naive realist, but they're not going to think of perception in those terms at all anyway. So, I do think that we need. I wasn't quite sure how talking about kinds was going to help. Do we want to know which kind are we interested in? There may be a psychological kind here. There may be the thing I'm interested in is just perception, and I don't know how better to pick that out other than that aspect of our ordinary, psychological economy that we all know and love.
But it starts to look like someone like Milner and Goodell, for example, who think precisely, at least on the caricature view, that unconscious processing deriving from vision takes place in a completely different neural pathway from conscious processing and is of a completely different kind. They're going to come out, by definition, as not believing in unconscious perception, on your view, because it's of a fundamentally different kind.
Well, so if they're thinking that what's going on in the dorsal stream at a psychological level is fundamentally different,
seems that's what they think.
Quantify computations that aren't the same kind as the representation of the vector stream, then that's true. There's a difference in the psychological kind. It doesn't straightforwardly follow that it might not count as perception in some other sense. I'm inclined to think it would be natural for that to be.
I think I just would like to add that it's known that the dorsal and the ventral pathways actually do talk to each other.
That's why I said the caricature view.
But I think the caricature is not that useful in that regard. I mean, both of them are going to be projected into parietal frontal areas. Both of them are then going to go to other subcortical. So I don't think it's that useful. I think, and this reminds me just a comment I wanted to make to happen, is the subcortical pathway can be very, very fast. So you can get to like an FEF very fast through that subcortical pathway before you would get if you go through LGN and V1, right? But at the end of the day, both of them are going there. So I think the cartoon of these complete separate pathways is just not very useful.
Okay, we started a little bit late, so we've got time maybe for 1 or 2 more questions. Yeah.
This is for Ian Phillips, and I don't, maybe it's a naive question, I don't quite understand what your criterion for discrimination is and why H&D doesn't discriminate.
So why DF doesn't count as discrimination? Well, I guess the question is it her doing something? Is she able to use what clearly is a representation, or at least a fleeting calculation of the position of that slot relative to her hand, to do something? I mean, one thing she arguably herself can't do is do the matching task.
What's the criteria for discrimination? The definition?
Well, can she discriminate? I mean, so for her to discriminate, we for her to distinguish between an orientation like that and an orientation from some other orientation. Now, really, that is at some level that discrimination is being made. The question is whether it's her who's doing it. And so I'm not sure it's turning on the notion of what's meant by discrimination as opposed to what counts for it to be her that's making the discrimination and what consequences and what needs to be in place for that to be true.
Right.
Hi, this is a question of clarification for Ian. Ned's position is that it's clear cut that the jumping spider can visually perceive, but it's an independent and difficult question whether it's conscious. Is your view that it's clear cut that the jumping spider can visually perceive, and that once we can see that that suffices for consciousness, we should see that it's clear cut that it's conscious? Or is your position that once we see that visual perception suffices for consciousness, then we see that it's not at all clear whether the jumping spider can visually perceive?
Yes, I was sort of responding ad hominem in the passage. Let's just grant an understanding of perception. Is there a good argument around the basis? So no, I don't think it's obvious that in the ordinary sense the jumping spider perceives. So the thought is just there's a good reason to think that these two things go together.
So you really think there's an ordinary sense of visual perception as opposed to seeing? I think in the ordinary sense of seeing, at least there's an ordinary sense of seeing in which people will say, of course the jumping spider can see.
Are they aware of anything?
Well, one sense of aware, yeah.
I mean,
in the sense of, representing features of it. Whether they're consciously aware is the other thing. That seems like an independent and very difficult question.
I guess I don't think it's obvious that the jumping spider is represented. Though it's not to say that there are not processes going on in the jumping spider, the evidence suggests it counts as representations of various things.
Okay, it's 7:10, so we now have a reception at the back to which everyone is warmly invited, but let us thank our panelists very much.